So my name is Jameson Lopp. For those of you who know me, you may be a little bit surprised. Why is this guy up here talking about DeFi? I thought he was a Bitcoin maximalist. So I've been working in the Bitcoin space for about 5 years now, mostly doing security stuff, and we're almost there. Maybe one or two more taps down, or can we get a full screen? Let's see. Almost. All right. So I'm not a DeFi expert. So when I was asked to come here and give a talk, I figured I should probably figure out what this DeFi thing was all about. So obviously I went to not Google, but DuckDuckGo, because it's a little better privacy engine, and I typed in, what is DeFi? And obviously I went to the first authority that could tell us what things actually mean. So as we all know, Merriam-Webster's English dictionary defines DeFi as challenge or defiance. And I figure, Merriam-Webster, they are the authority in this space. They must be correct. So I decided to base my entire presentation off of Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So if you're actually familiar with DeFi, then you're familiar with what it actually stands for, decentralized finance. What does that actually mean? I mean, if we look at this entire ecosystem that has grown up over the past couple of years, you'll see all kinds of stuff from custodial services, payments, infrastructure, exchanges, lending, yada, yada, yada. It looks a lot like traditional finance from a high level. But of course, you start digging in and you see, well, these different companies and projects, they're leveraging fairly breakthrough technologies to try to put a new spin on finance. We're decentralizing it. We're trying to get rid of a lot of the authorities in the system. But I think there's some good questions around, well, how well have we actually been able to do that? So what is decentralization? Well, of course, it means without a center. Unfortunately, this is a very vague term, and it's not necessarily always a good thing. And I try to get this point across here by showing you this decentralized network model in the middle. And that might look nice and pretty, but if you think adversarially and you look at that, you're going to see multiple single points of failure in there. So sure, there's no central point of the network, but if you take out one of those nodes or one of those other nodes, now your whole network is split apart and fractured, and you're probably going to have a lot of problems trying to actually do whatever you're trying to get done. So one of the things I'm going to try to point out in this talk is that we're not really just trying to go for decentralization. We're going for robustness. We're going for censorship resistance. We're going for an inversion of power. Like, we want control to be spread out to a sufficient degree that no one can abuse these systems for their own personal gain. So what is DeFi? I think that what we're really trying to go for is defiance. We are trying to build systems that are defiant against authorities. They continue to stand in defiance of those who want to wield power over us. So is it really DeFi if you have a single point of failure where some authority can turn something off, where some authority can dictate who gets to use the system or how do they get to use the system? I would argue that no, that is not really the goal of what we want with DeFi. So decentralization theater is a really big problem in this space. It's also a big problem to define and quantify in the first place, and I'll try to go into a little bit more explanation as to why I believe it's so complicated. One example here is decentralized lending. There are a number of decentralized lending platforms out there, and all of them have something in common, which is that they have gotten rid of the need for a centralized custodian, and that is great. That is an amazing first step away from the traditional financial models that we've had to live within for so long. But is that enough? Well, if you start digging in and looking at all of the other pieces of functionality that are required for decentralized lending, you'll notice that most, if not all, of these services have various centralized points that can become points of failure. And there are trade-offs as to why you may want that or not want that in different aspects of the system and how it functions. But ultimately, I think the question is, do we want to get to pure decentralization. Is the level of robustness and censorship resistance that provides actually worth the effort? And I think what you'll find, especially with all of these projects, is that it may be that the final end game of decentralization for a project is actually the decentralization of the developers, of the community behind that project. We see a lot of ICOs, a lot of companies, a lot of for-profit motivated endeavors, which is fine to get things off the ground. But I think that if you are going for the ultimate decentralized and robust system in the long term, you want to get as many, if not all of these aspects completely decentralized and basically run by a community of volunteers. So other choke points, these are all going to change depending on what type of system you're looking at, who is driving the consensus of the system, who is validating it, who may be controlling custody of assets. I think oracles in particular in DeFi are a really big question of how is this oracle working. And when I say oracle, I basically mean whenever you're running a system that needs to ingest data from outside of the system, how do you get that data into the system without simply throwing up your hands and pointing to one party and saying, oh, they're the ones who are going to be doing quality control for the data? For example, that could be price data getting into a lending service. So how are you going to solve the garbage in, garbage out problem of these systems, as like any other database, without handing over trust to someone? How decentralized do you need to make that oracle in order to make it robust against whatever adversaries, whatever failure modes you're really worried about? And another thing I think also that could be a problem in Ethereum, for example, is the rise of some of these really large infrastructure providers like Infura. You once again have to ask yourself, if we're building a really awesome decentralized app, but everyone is running the app and accessing the information from the system through a single service like Infura or some other infrastructure provider that makes it easy, what are the trade-offs that we're giving away there? Is it really still DeFi if we're all accessing a decentralized platform through a single choke point? So what is this about? This is about control. There's this famous quote, which I believe is not actually attributed to anyone in reality, that says, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." And that's because if you can control people's money, you can control their behavior, you can control their speech, you can control a lot of aspects of their lives. And I think this is one of the major reasons why Bitcoin, why cryptocurrency, why DeFi is really being developed by ideologically minded people, is because they understand all of the problems that this control can create over the long run, even if it's not obvious to the people who are using these systems from day to day. They're not really thinking about it. And so if we want to spread out control, if we want to make these systems more robust, we also need diversification. And you can think of this in terms of like biological diversification, where a single virus or pathogen can utterly decimate an entire ecosystem if it is homogeneous. That applies to pretty much anything, including software. So an example that happened in Bitcoin was that there was one piece of Bitcoin software called Bitcoin Unlimited, which had a few different critical errors in it that got exploited. And you can actually see this is a basically count of nodes of that implementation over time. There are multiple points in time where these critical vulnerabilities were discovered and exploited by adversaries and essentially crashed all of those pieces of software running in the system. Now, if Bitcoin had been a homogeneous network and this was the only software that was running the Bitcoin network, that would have been very dire. The entire network would have gone down. But thankfully, there's something like a dozen different Bitcoin implementations, and the problems that are found tend to be more localized rather than systemic. So this type of thing, I think, should also be applied to DeFi, which at the moment can be more prevalent if you're looking at things like smart contracts. If you only have like one team of developers working on one smart contract, you have to ask yourself, like, is that really sufficiently diversified to prevent these type of failures? Now, at a higher level, like working on the governance of these things, the evolution of these systems, you also have to ask yourself, what is the process for making changes to the system? AKA, what is the governance? Who has the control to decide what changes are made? And this is one of those weird things where worse is better from a certain standpoint. The more difficult it is to make changes to a system, the more robust that system is against some sort of attacker coming in and getting changes made to the system that end up being worse in the long run. This is, of course, also very hard to quantify. And apologies once again for the technical problem. If this was animated, then you would basically see a blossoming of data propagating across nodes on the Bitcoin network, which is a way that I try to describe to people what I believe is this new form of governance that has basically been created as a result of these decentralized systems. Instead of having top-down authorities basically do a command and control hierarchy where someone above dictates the change and then the rest of the people lower in the hierarchy have to follow those orders, it's actually the inverse. Instead, we have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of individual actors who are deciding themselves what rules do they want the system to run by, what game essentially do they want to play, and they are essentially creating bureaucracy by running these rules and by connecting to each other. And so rather than the rules of the system being imposed from below, they sort of bubble up from the bottom, where the individuals create this organic consensus that emerges as a result of the overlap in the rules that people agree upon. And it's sort of a lowest common denominator of consensus, if you will. Along the lines of control and robustness and freedom, really, within these systems, I think the privacy aspect is often overlooked, where we need to understand that privacy is an important part of freedom. They're basically two sides to the same coin, because knowledge is power. And I think a lot of people don't realize, or they don't think about the fact that when other people have knowledge of you, they have a degree of power over you, because they can see what you're doing, and they may be able to predict what you're going to do in the future. They may be able to influence actions. They may be able to put pressure on you based upon knowledge that they have. So if we want improved level of security and freedom from what we're experiencing today, we need to have this shield of privacy that basically prevents third parties from having power over us. And privacy needs to be the default. That's one thing that I've learned over the years, is that people are not going to choose privacy if it's not the default option. They're also not going to put in a lot of effort to get privacy if it's not the default. So it needs to be cheap, it needs to be easy, and if we're lucky, that can get us to a level of freedom we have not seen before. But one of the controversial aspects of freedom is that it will be abused by some people. And if we're going to build systems that truly are open finance, then, and this is going to be controversial for a number of people, they need to be open for terrorists. They need to be open for criminals. They need to be accessible for people to do bad things with. Because if your enemy cannot use the system, if you can dictate that someone that you don't like cannot use a system, that means there must be some point within the system that is not sufficiently decentralized, some point where authorities are exerting pressure on a choke point. And you have to ask yourself, if that is the case, what are we doing? Like, have we put in all of this effort, all of these resources, just to build another system that someone has control over and can dictate who can access that system? So, a real DeFi, I believe, is going to create liquid free markets. And free markets are black markets. And if people disagree with that, they're going to need to find other ways to to basically root out the bad actors rather than trying to control the base level of the system itself. Because you try to control the system, you're just going to ruin the integrity of everything that we've built so far. Another issue that I hope will continue to get solved is that so far it seems like most of DeFi has been just re-implementing traditional finance with a few tweaks to try to get rid of some of the third-party actors. I think there's a lot of room for innovation here, and that's what I hope that a lot of you will be focused on, is not just creating new ways to do old things, but creating completely new ways of interacting economically that have never even been possible before. I really like some of the P2P lending stuff. It seems to be coming along, and really what I think this ecosystem can enable us to do is to unlock a lot of the existing human capital that is already out there. You know, there are billions of people who don't have access to traditional finance, and if we can get them into this new financial system, you know, they already have plenty of economic and human capital themselves that is currently unable to be put to work. So if we can get them into a system in the first place, then I think that'll be good for us, it'll be good for the entire world. And looking back at old world stuff, I also see a lot of people that are building these traditional choke points type of technologies. I think that if we're going to go with a privacy-oriented route, trying to give people the freedom to do what they want, then we should be rejecting some of these legacy technologies, basically this reg tech that a number of people are working on. You know, there will be good business for that. I'm sure people will make a decent living with reg tech and trying to bridge the gaps between the new and the old world. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in moving forward and moving past a lot of that stuff. So this is why I think that DeFi should be about defiance, not decentralization. We need to defy the banks. We need to defy custodians, authorities. We need to defy anyone who is trying to exert control over us. And decentralization is a path to get there. It is the means. It is not the end. I believe the end is defiance, because we have seen for centuries, for millennia, authorities have been erecting these barbed wire fences, basically entrenching themselves into power. And they've been doing this often by creating things they call laws. And these laws are for our own good, for our own safety. But now we have the tools. We have the ability to build systems that run the rules to which we agree, not to which others dictate to us. And so we finally have the ability to cut these barbed wire fences. And I hope that you will join me in doing that, in defying the existing power structures and reaching out and building a truly free world. Thank you.